Now, after that somewhat pessimistic introduction, we have the perfect artist to engage our spirits in the morning and to start the symposium. Tutu Dutta. First, but first I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If you have comments or questions for the speakers in all of the following sessions, please put them only into the Q&A tab that you see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. They will then be compiled and passed to the speakers for their responses. So Tutu Dutta describes herself as a raconteur of tales, an urban nomad whose home base is Kuala Lumpur, but has lived in Singapore, Lagos, New York, Havana, and Zagreb. Dutta is the author of 9 books intended primarily for children and young adults that feature female protagonists and a reverence for nature. Timeless Tales of Malaysia, a collection of folk tales and legends adapted for children, was her first book, released in 2015. It was selected by Time Out as a notable feminist writing from Malaysia. She followed it with Magic Urn and other timeless tales of Malaysia in 2017. Her other books, 8 Treasures of the Dragon, the Jugra Chronicles set in 17th century Borneo, the Phoenix Song, a picture book illustrated by Martian Peluso, Nights of the Dark Moon, a collection of dark folk tales from Asia and Africa. In 2019, she co-edited an anthology, The Principal Girl, with Dr Sharifah Aishah Osman. And her latest book is The Blood Prince of Langkasuka, published by Penguin Random House this year. So once again, please put your questions for the speaker into the Q&A tab that you see at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And please welcome Tutu Dutta, who will speak for 35 minutes, followed by the Q&A. Thank you. Tutu.
Good morning. Thank you, Professor Langenbach, and also thank you to Professor Reed, the chairman. Okay, thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to start my PowerPoint presentation, which is adapting traditional folk tales to create your own stories. So, okay. Yeah, this is actually, okay, so adapting traditional folk tales to create your own stories. So this, I came up with all these methods to create your own stories based on analysis of a number of children and young adults books, and also from my own experience writing my own book. So the question is, how do you incorporate folktales into the plot of your original story, or turn an ancient folktale into a contemporary story? So an analysis of a number of books indicate there are 4 ways of using folktales in fiction. Yeah, can I have the next slide, please? So we go from the most simple to the complex. The first is we can just retell the folk tale. And secondly, we can dress old tales in new clothes. I will give examples of each as we go along. The third is using a quest or a journey, or even a storyteller, to string together a series of folk tales. Fourth is weaving folk tales into a new story. That means you come up with your own idea of a story, and you incorporate folk tales into this. And weaving folk tales into a contemporary story. Number 4 is the story is actually set in the past, whereas 4.1, you update it and bring it to the present. So can I have the next slide, please? Okay, next we come to retelling of folk tales. So I'm sure all of us know folk tales which come from our countries, our culture. So this is a time-honored tradition amongst storytellers and writers that is collecting oral folk tales from people in villages and countrysides and publishing them in written form. I think in the West, there's a long history of written folk tales, and so these writers from a long ago became household names. We have Charles Perrault, the Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, and more recently, this is the effort to compile folk tales is actually continuing even until now, I think, even in Malaysia, because in many countries in Asia, well, with the exception of Japan, China, and India, they have a long history of folk tales, and it has been written down. But countries such as, let's say, Malaysia, Indonesia, even Thailand, and so on, it's still ongoing. We are still in the process of doing that. So, but more recently, we have American writers such as Jane Yolen, Angela Carter from the UK, Grace James, A.K. Ramanujan, and Linda Gunn still carry on this tradition. But we think that these are not just compilations. That means you're not just collecting stories and writing them as you hear them. This method is quite okay. It's acceptable for academic publishing, but if you're actually writing for children and a modern audience, you need to retell them. So why is it necessary to retell folk tales? Can I have the next slide, please? Yes. So why is it necessary? So in many cases, these stories are fragments. Some parts of the stories are missing. So research on folk tales should not just focus on one particular folk tale, but also on similar stories and variants of the story. Which means that if you go to different parts of the country or to a different storyteller, you may get a different version of this. And some of these stories are also found perhaps all over the region. So it's good to collect different versions of the story and see whether you can piece them together to come up with a more complete story. So reading a few versions of the same story will give you a feel for the story and help to fill in the missing pieces. Yes, if you have any questions, please, type them out. So first of all, folk tales lack this description. Oral stories are usually pure narratives, which means sometimes we don't have the names of the character and no description of what they look like, the time, the place where they live, what's the setting. So when you're retelling, it's good to give it's actually a combination of your imagination plus the oral tale itself. So we try to imagine what the character actually looks like, and even sometimes if there's no name, give them names and place them in a certain time and a certain setting. And this forms a backdrop to the story. And for modern readers, this is quite necessary. So details such as old place name, historical personages, cultural practices give the story depth and context. So this is necessary. Otherwise, modern readers would not be interested in engaging with your stories. And oral folk tales tend to lack dialogues. So we have to imagine conversation between the characters and perhaps their motivation, why they are doing what they are doing. So stories like dialogues, contemporary readers expect a complete story with characters. Well, for example, in 8 Treasures of the Dragon, there's this story called Dragon Wells of Yanjing. A folk tale from China, Dragon Wells of Yanjing from 8 Treasures of the Dragon, was based on the story of a dragon king and queen who decided to punish the people of Yanjing for destroying their home when the city builders drained the lake which was their home. They avenged themselves by stealing all the water in the city wells. So in one version of the story, Kublai Khan was mentioned. So I decided to research the history of Beijing. So with a bit of research, I discovered that Kublai Khan did indeed redesign the city. A huge lake was drained and a canal built to connect Yanjing with the south. So that is the history. Legends tell us that the draining the lake had dire consequences for the people of Yanjing. So there's a bit of environmentalism there. Okay, now we come to two different books. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, next slide, please. Yes. So there are two ways of the principal girl is an anthology, which is it's a collection of short stories written by various writers. So one way you could go about publishing your own book is to involve many writers. For example, there are almost 20 writers involved in the production of the principal girl. So it's based on the folk tales, although some are original stories and some are based retelling of folk tales. And there are two versions of the Princess of Mount Ledang. This is a quite unique Malaysian folk tale. I'm not sure if any of you have read it, but when you read this book, you realize that the same story can be retold in different ways. And in Bright Landscape, a collection of stories. This is a single author, definitely. So also based on, most of the stories are original and they are contemporary, but she takes Malaysian folktales, for example, about Pontianaks, and so on, and incorporate them in this story. So there's one about a group of friends meeting in a remote place where one of them could be actually be a supernatural creature and terrorizes the others. And an uncle who married a woman who could be a Pontianak. Apparently, it's based on her own family. And one or two about a woman who kept tiger spirits. So these are just ideas on how, we can come up with our own stories. And okay, we come to the second method, dressing old tales in new clothes, which means you take a very ancient story and you set it in a modern, let's say a contemporary, not actually modern, contemporary setting, and retell it, or rather reimagining. This is actually reimagining. Earlier on, that was retelling. So in step 2, we take an old story and give it a modern look or interpretation. In effect, dress old tales in new clothes. But the plot more or less remains the same, or the relation between the characters. So I'm using The Owl Service by Alan Garner. It's quite a famous book and published in 1967. So this book relives an old legend, the ancient Welsh legend about someone called Liu and his wife, Blodeuwedd, I think. Later, she fell in love with someone, quite a difficult name to pronounce, called Grenau, and together they conspired to murder Liu. It's a very ancient folk tale. So let's look at the modern interpretation. So Garner's book is about 3 teenagers who were thrown together by circumstances and they became caught up in a love triangle. So in The Owl Service, just as in the legend, there's a girl and 2 boys, or 2 men. Alison is Blodeuwedd, Gwyn is Liu, and Roger is Grenau. So what happens is like they became possessed by the spirits of these people from ancient legends. So we learned that Gwyn's ancient ancestors probably owned the valley, even though his mother works as a housekeeper for Alison's mother and her stepfather, Clive Bradley. So if you're interested, you could take a look at this. Can I have the next slide? Yes, The Bloody Chamber is actually a reimagining of the story of Bluebeard. It's actually not a children's story. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. This is it's a very dark fairy tale about a man who marries young women, but they disappear after like a couple of months. So it's probably one of the earliest stories of, I would say, a serial killer. So you can look at the modern interpretation. First read the old version and then see how Angela Carter, she sets it like in the 1920s and how she retold or reimagined it. Can I have the next slide? Okay, the third method is using a quest or a journey to string together folk tales. Basically, if what you have is, let's say you know a couple of short stories, but you want to write a novel. So you have to like string them together. And one of the ways is to make the character go on a quest or a journey. In fact, most books for young adults and middle grade involve some kind of quest. So here the story has an original plot, a main story arc. This is the major, the main arc is the one that links from the story from beginning to end, but then you have subplots, smaller arcs. So these are like events or adventures in the story. For example, using Where the Mountain Meets the Moon by Grace Lin. In the main story arc, Min Lee, a little girl from a very poor village called Fruitless Mountain Valley. You can tell from the name of the, Fruitless Mountain. It's a very poor place and they are not doing well because the ground is infertile. So and it's dry. So she goes on a quest to see the old man of the moon in an attempt to change the fortune of her family and her village. Along her journey, she meets and befriends a friendly dragon who is unable to fly. So the dragon itself is a character from a famous folktale about the lifelike but unfinished painting of a dragon by a master painter, which came to life when the painting was completed by someone else by drawing in the dragon's eye. So she incorporates an old folktale as a minor story arc into the major arc. So Min Lee and the dragon decide to help one another. Min Lee in her quest for fortune, which she thinks will bring her happiness, and the dragon in his quest for flight. So they encounter they have many adventures along the way. For example, they meet a troop of monkeys which is also from ancient Chinese folktale, who totally rob forests of peach trees of their fruits. So can I have the next slide? Yes, another way, rather than making the character go on a quest, is a story. We use a storyteller to string folktales together. I think there's okay. Here we use Nick and the Secrets of the Sunset Ship by Ninot Aziz. This is a Malaysian writer. So the main story arc is about Nick, a young and gifted sailor. He's actually training for the Olympics, who goes on holiday to a seaside resort in Terengganu to sort out his feelings. So this is the main story arc. So one day when he's walking along the beach, he sees a wooden ship with dark sails and meets an old man, Pak Hitam, who tells him a series of folk tales about the sea. So these tales are actually from Malay folklore. So the thing is, each time Pak Hitam tells him a story, Nick actually becomes one of the characters in the tale. So Nick relieves the story and comes to understand the long seafaring history of Nusantara. He also rediscovers his passion for sailing. So the thing is, each time the Pak Hitam tells him a story, so we have an event. So he tells him a number story, we have a long string of events, and this helps to bring the book together, but they are not as integrated into the story as Grace Lin's book. So since he's actually imagining it rather than actually going on a quest. But since the protagonist is an observer rather than a participant in the story, but it's also another method of using stringing together a string of smaller tales into a bigger one. Okay, next slide, please. Then we come to weaving folktales into a new story strand. For this, I'm using Sarah J. Maas' book, Court of Thorns and Roses. She wrote a number of huge books, sold all over the world, but this her first one could be one of the best. So at this level, the folktales are not independent stories, but become fully integrated into the main plot or story arc. The characters from folktales are fully fleshed out as protagonists and antagonists. In some cases, folktales form subplots which are an important part of the story arc. So looking at this story, you can see that it's based on two main folktales. One is that of Tamlin from Scotland, and the second is Beauty and the Beast from France. So in the Scottish folktale, Tamlin is abducted by the Queen of Fairies and turned into one of her knight's huntsmen whose job is to guard a forest grove. A young woman called Janet trespasses into the forest and plucks a rose which summons Tamlin. Janet falls in love with him, but Tamlin tells her that he will be sacrificed as the 7th year of his captivity is approaching. In the end, Janet saves him through her courage and tenacity. So read the book to find out how she changed the characters. So in Court of Thorns and Roses, Tamlin is Lord of the Spring Court in the fairy realm. He takes a young woman called Fairy captive for killing a sacred wolf. She falls in love with him, but later finds out that he and everyone in the mansion is cursed by the fairy queen, and she could have freed him by declaring her love. But she didn't know that. When he is taken captive by the fairy queen and she has to save him through both a test of skill and strength as well as a test of brains, that is solving a riddle. So read the story again. And next we come to 3 books by, Peony Lantern. So characters, ideas, and storylines taken from Japanese folklore directly into her stories. So the Peony Lantern incorporates, I'm just basically going to, can I have the next slide? On the first book, on the last book actually. So it incorporates a few myths and folktales into its storyline. The title of the book itself refers to an eerie Japanese ghost story. Even, Peony Lantern is a folktale by itself, but the story as told here is quite different. A central subplot is the story of Howari and the Princess of the Sea. I retold this story in 8 Treasures of the Dragon. So it's the story of 2 brothers, Prince Firefade and Prince Fireflash, who are bitter rivals. So one day, Howari gets lost at sea and is taken to the palace of the Sea King. I think if you are familiar with fairy tales, you would have read this. He falls in love with the Sea King's daughter and marries her. After some time, Howari is overcome with homesickness and decides to return home. He's given a treasure chest and 2 magical pearls as gifts of the sea. So it's this story is fully incorporated. In fact, the emperor in the story is actually Howari, but he loses his memory and doesn't remember that he was actually this prince. So in the book, then the author, because she stretched it into a much larger piece of work, so she has 2 villains, the Jewel Maid and Lord Marish Houghton re-emerge. So they are looking for the objects of power known as the wind flowers. No one realized that the wind flowers were actually the 2 pearls, the tide ebbing and tide flowing pearls, which had been given to Howari by the Sea King. So the emperor had forgotten that he was Howari, and that he had also forgotten about these 2 jewels. I'm just giving you a plot point, yeah? So Ruth Manley successfully incorporated this old myth into an integral part of the story. Okay, can I have the next slide? So next we come to Phoenix Song, which is something which I wrote. It's actually for children who are about 8 years old, but I incorporated elements from two folk tales to create a new story. So this follows the pattern of dressing old, it's also old tales in new clothes, and also a reimagining of two different folk tales. So I draw upon two separate folk tales. One is the Malay folk tale of Buluh Perindu, and then the Chinese folk tale of the Xiao and the Phoenix. So the Malay folk tale of Buluh Perindu, can I have the next slide? So the first one is the Malay folk tale of Buluh Perindu, literally yearning or sighing bamboo. In the origin story, three brothers were given the task of bringing back a bamboo cutting from a hill which was haunted or cursed. The two elder brothers ignored the advice of an old man they met they met on the way up, and they were turned to stone. The younger, so his two brothers went up the hill and were turned to stone. So the youngest brother had to go up the hill to save his two elder brother, but he showed respect for the old man and followed his advice and counsel, and managed to obtain a piece of the magical Buluh Perindu. He made a flute out of the bamboo and succeeded in reversing the curse on his brothers just by playing the flute, because it's the bamboo is magical. So I was quite impressed by the story, but of course I gave the characters names, and it's also contemporary. It's set like in our time rather than in the past. So although the bamboo flute produced beautiful music, there were no other stories about its power to break curses. You can also refer to Mozart's The Magic Flute, which has a flute which can break curses. Later, I came across a Chinese legend of the wild woodsman who was such a, he was so gifted. He could tame wild animals and even summon the phoenix whenever he played the xiao, a Chinese bamboo flute. If any magical creature could break a curse, it would be the phoenix. Okay. So the two stories seem to fit because they both involve a bamboo flute and the magic of music. So in this story, so the two brothers get lost in the hill. They got turned into, like they were overcome by plants, almost turned into stone. And then the younger brother goes up. He makes a flute from the bamboos which are growing on the hill. And when he plays the flute, he summons the phoenix, and the phoenix sings and saves his two brothers. So I combined two different folk tales from two different traditions. Okay, can we have the next slide? Okay, this is a novella I wrote. It's in two parts. One is Mia and the Forest Demon. So, and the two, they are known as the Jugra Chronicles. Mia and the Forest Demon. So how did I go about this? I had actually already read folktale based on Sarawak. So I decided to expand it into a novella. So first decide on a setting for your story, the place and the time. When writing a story set in this part of the world, always wise to consider the two main trade routes of the past. One is the overland silk road actually, and the sea-bound spice route. So we are actually in the midst of the spice route, the so-called Spice Islands, the Moluccas. And I decided to set it in Borneo and make it a part of the spice trade, spice route, so that we have characters, for example, from China, because there's a lot of trade with this part of the world. And this helps to make the story bigger rather than just setting it, let's say, in a village in Borneo. So the second book, can I have the next slide? The second book of the Jugra Chronicles is Rigay and the Witch of Moon Lake. So the story is set in Borneo due to the unique and diverse folklore tradition associated with including like there's head hunting, the use of magic. So I set it in the coastal region near Brunei. In the past, the Sultan of Brunei, he actually ruled the whole of Borneo. And also it involves the two states, Sabah and Sarawak, and they meet Brunei and Indonesian Kalimantan here. So set in the 17th century, over 100 years after the fall of the Malacca Empire. So in the story, they also refer to Malacca because it was so famous. So the people in the village, even though they are quite in a remote place, they have heard that, you know, the empire had fallen and it's taken over by the Portuguese and later by the Dutch. And the city in this the story moves from actually between two villages, one in Sarawak, one in Sabah, and also in Brunei. And the city in Brunei is called Tanjung Pura. So it's set against a backdrop. There's a power struggle in Tanjung Pura, an ancient trading kingdom with ties to the Han Kingdom, China, and Hindustan, India, and also Majapahit in Indonesia and Malacca, which is now under the Dutch. Okay, can I have the next slide? Okay, this is my most recent book, just published last year, and The Blood Prince of Langkasuka. So based on the ancient legend of Raja Bersiung, I think we all have heard about this legend, yeah? So, well, it's quite well known, and one or two movies has made from this, and the story is still quite famous in at this present time, and it's based in Kedah. So I think the kingdom of Langkasuka includes Kedah and the north of Thailand plus Cambodia. So it's been reframed as a coming of age story of a prince who was turned into a vampire. And some research I did indicates that he was actually a 12th century prince, which puts him in the time frame of the Bujang Valley, with quite a famous, one of the most ancient archaeological sites in Malaysia. And since this is actually also quite a short story, I had to expand it. So I also incorporated the Malay folktale of the bamboo princess, and I imagine her as being his mother. And the bamboo princess is actually part part fairy and part human. And the story has mythical creatures from Indian folklore, that is Batala. These are actually vampires, and the Yakshi, which is like nature spirits or fairies. So they play an important role in the story. But I also use Malay folklore and refer to Malay magic. So characters like Tok Pawang, who are shamans, and the most powerful one is the Tok Pawang, because she summons the rice spirit every year for the harvest festival. So you could take a look at the book so to find out which parts were taken from, you know, which folk tales and so on. Now we come to two, I don't know how much, okay. So you're quite lucky, because nowadays we didn't have this kind of books when I was young, but now we have The Girl and the Ghost by Hannah Alkaf and Blackwater Sister by Zan Cho. Both are set in Malaysia and very recently published, just like 1 or 2 years ago. So The Girl and the Ghost by Hannah Alkaf. A girl inherits a ghost. This is a pelicit. If you are familiar with Malay folklore, you would know about. It's quite a frightening, spirit. So she's quite a lonely girl because her mother is like very busy. So she inherits a spirit from her grandmother without the knowledge of her mother. And but this spirit has a dark side, and it's been a bomo, or a character who is quite evil has discovered that she has this spirit and wants to control it. So she has to fight the forces of darkness to free herself and the ghost, and she has the help of a friend. The next one by Zancho, this is Blackwater Sister. Also, it seems quite similar. In The Girl and the Ghost, the girl is quite an urban, she comes from the cities and doesn't know anything about this kind of things. And in Blackwater Sister, a young woman actually, because it's a young adult literature. She grows up in the US and then she comes back to Penang and doesn't know anything about local culture. But she also inherits a spirit from her grandmother who has passed and known as Blackwater Sister. And her grandmother wants her to have revenge on someone, a powerful person whom she dislikes. And occasionally she will possess her body and force her, to do things. So two quite interesting books. So you can take a look at them and see how the writer incorporates Malaysian folklore into her two books. And
excuse me, about 5 more minutes.
Okay. I'm the Ladies of Grace Adieu. Okay, I'm going to next slide. Okay, let's since I only have 5 more minutes. So let's compare two unique characters one is from the Mahabharata and Lord of the Rings. Okay, so Shikandi. There's a character here called Shikandi who was born female but raised as a man. It was her destiny to kill the leader of the Kauravas, Bhima, a man who could not be killed as long as he raised his bow. So Krishna asked Shikandi to become his charioteer, knowing that Bhima would lower his bow. The thing is, nobody knew that Shikandi was actually a woman apart from Bhima. And when he saw her, he realized that it was a woman and he couldn't kill her and he had to lower his bow. And that was how he was killed. So this came from the Mahabharata. Now we come to Lord of the Rings. Eowyn, I think most of us have seen this, the movie, yeah? Some of us have read the book. So Eowyn, the shield maiden of Rohan, managed to slay the witch king of Atma by stabbing him in the face in the battle of Minas Tirith. So the witch king of Atma was supposed to be, apparently there was a prophecy that he could not be killed by any man, but he didn't know that Eowyn was a woman. So she was able to overcome the prophecy. Yeah? Being a woman, she was able to circumvent the prophecy that no man could kill the witch king. So you could compare these two stories and see whether Tolkien actually may have gotten his idea from the Mahabharata. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. And you could visit my blog if you're interested, yeah? Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I would like to thank Uta for inviting me to this talk, and thank you to everyone. So that's all for now. If you have any question, you can just send it over. I'll try to answer them.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, we started a little early, so I hope you had enough time to do what you wanted to do. We do have some questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
One which I'd like to ask you to start off with. I think it was Salman Rushdie said, either it was in Midnight's Children or it was maybe in an interview, that stories stick to him. And it seems that stories stick to you as well. What was it if you can remember early in your life that made it possible for that to happen, that stories find you. Yeah, if you could talk about maybe your early experience with stories when you were a child.
Our uncle used to read to us and tell us stories about witches in Bengal, but at that time I didn't know how to read. But later on, it's hard to explain. It's like I'm driven to read, to pick up books, and I was especially attracted to books which had beautiful illustration. And when I write, I'm aware of the fact that children are very attracted to attractive books. So picture books are very important. Well, it's hard to say, maybe some of us we are naturally wired in that way, that we are, maybe all of us are, we are attracted to stories and to books. So I'm not sure whether I answered your question.
Yeah, there's a related question that somebody asked in the Q&A. What inspired Tutu to undertake such works? Apart from publication, how have you used your works?
Okay. I think the fact is, because I did a lot of reading as a child, I have a lot of knowledge about, and I'm especially attracted to books about folk tales and fairy tales. So I found out basically that there were not very many books, especially from this part of the world, that are like interesting to young adults and to children. So I decided to do something about it. For example, most of the books I mentioned were published very recently, let's say in the last 5 years, and maybe 5-6 years ago. So I felt there was a need, so I decided to write books which I'm interested in. Okay. Yeah, the other thing is, okay, sorry.
Sorry?
Yeah, my first book was published about 10 years ago. So that was a time when there were not many books available from this part of the world. I was trying to fill a need. And also, since my husband works as a diplomat, I travel all over the world where I get to pick up stories and meet people from very diverse, cultures and so on. And I also had the time to do some writing. So perhaps it's a number of factors which made me decide to come up with these books. And I would say that we are very lucky that, people like Hannah Alkaf, Zencho, and there are a number of, in fact, many others who are from this part of the world, Southeast Asia, who are recently published. So we should support local writers and books which are published based on the culture of this part of the world.
Okay, another question here. What advice would you give authors who are afraid of committing the crime of cultural appropriation by writing about folk tales not from their culture?
Okay. I think, for example, my story, The Blood Prince of Langkasuka, is based very much on Malay folklore, but it's something which, if it's something that you're really interested in and you actually have some in-depth knowledge, I don't see any problem that you write a story which is based on a different culture. if but basically it shouldn't be merely for commercial purpose, or you think that you're writing this because you think this is the in thing, or it will or it will sell. But if if any writer actually has enough interest to do a great deal of research and to take the trouble to understand it, I think it should be. And you have actually lived live in that culture as well. So I think that should be all right.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, do you feel that I mean, what would be the signs of overstepping that? What would for you in your own ethics of writing, how do you sort of set those boundaries?
Well, I still think it's there has to be some love for that culture, some love and understanding, and the interest to research it, and also having spent some time there, rather than, let's say, someone from who let's say they write a story about Malaysia, but they live somewhere, in a totally different country, and has barely spent any time in this country, and hasn't done enough, But it's hard. Yes, I agree. It's hard to set the boundaries actually. But I think a writer, has a right to to write whatever it is they want. It's up to the readers to decide whether they're authentic.
Yeah, is there a culture of criticism when it comes to children's books in this way? I mean, where you have critics writing about writers and their work. Do you feel that there's, I mean, it's one of the problems in the visual arts that I'm involved, that there aren't sufficient critics to deal with the issues that arise in the visual arts. Do you feel that there is that culture, and a kind of dialogue around the issues around writing? Do you feel here in Malaysia and elsewhere, particularly with children's books or young adult books?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but Zencho, for example, lives in the UK, but she grew up, spent most of her life in Malaysia. It's just very quiet. So her stories are set in Malaysia. I don't know. I think you have, maybe there's a feeling that if you write about your own culture, it's more authentic. But the one thing I can refer to is, like the story of the Last Airbender, the Avatar. And I think that was written by people in the West, but it was hugely popular all over the world. I know it's not written by Asian, but I really like that, the entire series. I think I've watched it, many years ago. And I think the writers did a great deal of research and had quite a bit of understanding about Asian culture. So I didn't feel that that it was not appropriate or anything. I still think basically it comes down to how much you are willing to put in and not be superficial about things. And I think I forgot what's the recent Disney movie. I think
Raya and the Last Dragon.
Yes, I think, but I think this the screenwriter is actually Malaysian. So so that I suppose we find it easier to accept knowing that she's actually from this part of the world and the story is set in this part. Okay.
Here's another kind of slightly related question from Chin Kian Hong. This is Tutu. How do you face the sensitive issues such as religion or culture understanding when you decide to put them in your story? Will you harmony that issue or using new examples to convert into another situation?
Okay, religious sensitivity. Okay, well, first of all, I rarely write contemporary stories. I'm working on a novel which is contemporary, set in like 2010, but in that story, I avoid like actually discussing religion. So it's a sort of young adult literature, but it's more about their life situation, you know, what they think about school. So there's not much, practically nothing about religion, and they're very ambitious. They want to be cheerleaders. They want to be chosen to take part in the final year concert and things like that. So there's nothing much about religion. So the stories which are written in the past actually goes back like before the, for example, like the Blood Prince of Langkasuka is based on the 12th century Nusantara. So it's there's a bit of animism, and they also have some Hindu and Buddhist influence, but basically religion does not play a huge part in my story. And I don't actually focus on that because I'm more interested in folklore, and there's quite a bit of shamanism, but that's about it. And magic and so on. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, or this person's question. Yeah, and I don't think we have so many people that if somebody wants to ask or to respond directly, that we could also perhaps have that. Here's one about the act of writing. When you had your story to retell, or when you have your story to retell, how do you write without losing motivation? Is a question from Angeline Wong.
Okay, losing motivation as in like completing the story, I suppose. Actually, some of this, for example, the Blood Prince of Langkasuka may have started like 7, 8 years ago. So I wrote a first draft. What I do is, in fact, it was rejected by quite a number of people. So I was quite surprised when Penguin Southeast Asia picked it up. And I'm grateful for them for publishing this book. But it's good to have a group of people to work with. For example, there's a Malaysian writers community and also a Malaysian Writers Society. I think before the lockdown, we used to meet every week in cafes. So when you sit down with a group, you're more motivated to write. And when you have completed your, like let's say a first draft of your manuscript, you might want to get like beta readers, people who are interested in giving you feedback. So by making it very active and dynamic, being part of a writing community and so on, maybe it sort of pushes you to finish it. And from the feedback you get an idea whether you're on the right track or whether there's something else that needs to be done. And First, and finally, I have to say that research is very important, even for contemporary, especially for contemporary, actually, maybe contemporary stories set in this time. You really have to not be too shallow, you know. Okay, so I see a question. Hi, do you consider charm as positive sometimes as in magic? Yeah. Can I look at the question again?
Which question?
There was a question about shamanism.
I don't see it. Okay, are you looking at the chat?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Hi, Judah. Do you consider shamanism as positive, sometime as positive as magic that could work wonders?
Okay. Again, I try to be very inclusive. I'm very interested in many different things. And when you're writing a story, it's not about you in this world. What you do is you create a completely different a world which has different rules from the world that you're actually living in reality. So I don't actually judge whether it's positive or negative, but when you create this world, I think many science fiction and fantasy writers call it world building. So in this world that you create, there are different rules. So things like shamanism and magic has a place in the world that you create. So I think that's the way to, if you are writing in this particular genre, that you create a world which has different rules, and some of this, some of the values are not the same as, you know, as the world that we are living in. So that's what that's my answer.
Yeah, I mean, there is this immersive quality in books that we've all experienced. And you enter in, and then you come out
Yes. So it depends on your skill in world building, that so that when someone reads it, they feel that it's authentic, that you are walking in a, you know, in a different reality where there are different rules, and yeah, where, you know, magic could be real.
I think Eugene has a question that he wanted to ask directly. Eugene, you want to? He's part of the organizing committee. Do you want to turn on your mic and ask your question? Maybe he didn't hear me. Okay. Do you see if I've hit all of these questions?
No.
There are. Eugene?
Yep. Hi.
Good.
Yeah.
So sorry. Hi, Tutu.
Hi.
I can't put my I'm actually one of the panelists, so I couldn't put my question in the Q&A section. I'm an illustrator and an artist, and I'm wondering, my question is, whenever you have a collaboration to do a book, and I noticed some of your books have illustrations, and obviously the cover does have an illustration.
Yes.
Does the publisher actually have a say in it, or do you yourself pick the illustrators? And I mean, how do you choose an illustrator? Do you decide on style, and what's the process like when you decide on to collab with an illustrator in a project like this?
Okay. For example, going back to Phoenix Song, yeah, that is a picture book, which means it's like 50%. It's 50% writer, 50% illustrator. And then what happens is, in that case, Lantana, they pick the illustrator, and she's now quite a famous, that's Martian Peluso, quite a famous illustrator of children's book. She's from Italy, so that was picked by the publisher. I didn't actually have a say in that, but In The Magic Urn and other Timeless Tales, I actually did the illustration myself because I couldn't afford to hire someone, but I don't do that anymore. And then for like Eight Treasures of the Dragon, that's by Tan Wei Fen. I know her personally, and I approached her and she agreed to, to take part in this book, and I paid her for her illustrations. Okay, and then okay, let's say the Blood Prince of Langkasuka. Most of the time, writers actually don't have a say in the illustrate, especially when you go to a major publisher. But in my contract, I sort of specified I wanted to have a say on what the cover looks like, and I actually wrote down the theme for the cover or what I wanted it to look like, and they hired an illustrator to create the cover. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. So actually, there is no fixed rule. It kind of depends on your contract and what you decide on and how much control you have over a particular right.
Yeah,
Okay, yes,
exactly.
thank you. Thank you very much. That helps a lot. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, the having live questions actually is quite nice. It's there's a kind of rigidity to the Q&A format, which maybe we can break up a little bit. Are there any other live questions that people would like to ask? Meanwhile, I'll ask this one, which is on the chat string. Any ideas how to encourage young people to read stories in the age of TikTok?
Yeah, it's quite sad actually, because sometimes when I go out to read, to give readings and so on, I see many, especially those people, children who are in their early teens, and they are like obsessed with their cell phone and they are staring at it, even though there's a writer, that they could listen to and ask questions. It's quite a difficult question. I think parents have to be more aware that that the screen is extremely addictive. Even sometimes I spend like too much time on my handphone. So I think it actually affects our brain. We get so used to constant stimulation. It may be difficult for us to actually pay attention to a living person rather than looking at the screen. I really can't say, except it's good that we have so many books which are interesting to read now, especially in the last 5-10 years, and there's a role for parents to play, especially for young children, that they not give them, for example, handphones until they reach a certain age. I don't know. I think maybe we should bring back the handphones which doesn't have a screen. Earlier versions which we can just speak and send messages, but you can't actually look at games or So I think it depends on the parents.
Yeah, I mean, there's another sort of corollary to that, which I notice in myself. I love culture. I love art. And so there is a tendency to immerse in other people's art and to lose my own stories. Mm-hmm. So how does one, go through, and what technique do you use to become reflective on your own stories, and rather than constantly bouncing or immersing in other people's stories? And then somebody is asking online how to ensure the freshness of a story when one creates, despite borrowing known tales? You know, how do you produce the freshness out of a tale that maybe everybody has already heard at one time or another? You know, let's say a famous folk tale. How do you then bring a kind of freshness to it? But I'm curious also in your process of observation in life of yourself and other people, how do you listen to people? How do you bring the tales out of your own life?
I'm not sure whether okay. Let's go back to the earlier one, like to make it fresh. I think I mentioned the Princess of Mount Putri Gunung Ledang, the Princess of Mount Ledang, and how I've actually retold it in one of my books, but then you can also look at the Principal Girl. One version of the story is told in a very traditional way, which we all have read, and then there's another one, the Girl on the Mountain by Prita Samarasan. So she has completely like changed it around. She made the princess something of a wild child, you know, who's like dressed in animal skins and has got like flowers in her hair. So it's completely different from. And then look at Daphne Lee's version, which is okay. One thing, if you read a story and you want to retell it, so try to think what happened before. So the story is just this from this moment until this moment, a certain time span. So what you look at, try to imagine what happened before this story takes place. It's a kind of prequel, and then also try to imagine what happens after this folk tale, you know, the one that you're reading. So that makes it more interesting. So you have this within this time span. So what happened before? Try to gain some insight into the events and the character, and then move on, and maybe what happened after, you know, like the Princess of Mount Leda in the traditional tales. She told the Sultan of Malacca that she didn't want to marry him. So what many did was what also I did. What made her like that? Why didn't she want to marry the Sultan? Why was she making all these demands? So try to look into her motivation and then go back to before. So what happened before this, the folktale, which has been told so many times, what happened before that? So that's one way of approaching it, this kind of stories and making it different. And the other way is, for example, the Blood Prince of Langkasuka. In the traditional one, he's actually an older person, like maybe middle-aged person who's very, I would say, quite very bloodthirsty and greedy and sort of. But I've reframed it as a coming of age story. That means he's only like 15 or he's about 16 years old, and how he became a vampire, you know. Rather than I didn't accept the original version, it was because he was served food which was tainted with blood, and that made him turn into a vampire. Rather, I tried to imagine how he actually turned into a vampire. Also based on contemporary stories of vampires, you know. Yes, how to focus on your own story. I think you must feel a real need to want to write your own story, and maybe takes inspiration from the things that you have read. Yeah, that's.
Do you ever have
Professor Ray, Datin, I'm afraid we have to wrap in the next 3 minutes.
Okay. All right. Do you ever have the sense that the stories are mirrors for you, and that you're writing, even though you're writing about somebody else, that you're actually maybe detailing it with your own experience, your own life?
Yes. Well, definitely. I suppose how I mean every writer would. It does come from your mind, I suppose, yeah. But it's not just based on your own life, also based on your readings actually, because you know what they say, that when you read books, it's like living many lives and going through many cultures and many different times. So it's just not just based on your own perception, but from the books that you have read. But yeah, ultimately everything goes through your own mental processes, but also draws from many other minds. Okay, I think that's.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
It was very informative. So in a few minutes, Dr. Sun will be taking over, and we'll be moving to the next session.
Okay, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
And thank you for those questions, Professor Ray.